welcome to the Teaching Together podcast, where we celebrate and share the glows and grows of teacher life. I'm Sierra, and today I'm thrilled to be joined by a very special guest and co-host of the podcast Educate to Self-Regulate, Dr. Shyam Barr. Shy is an experienced secondary teacher, leader, education consultant, and researcher, currently working as a professional associate at the University of Canberra. Shy, thank you so much for your time today, and I'm really excited for this conversation and can't wait to unpack some of the ambiguity around some big words that we hear in the education world, like metacognition and self-regulated learning.
Hi, Sierra. It is an absolute pleasure to be here today. Always love talking with fellow passionate educators who just love digging deeper into how we learn and how we can foster this kind of learning skill set, self-regulated learning skill set in our young people. So thank you for the opportunity.
Well, you may know that we always kick off our show with a glow or a grow from our recent teaching experiences. In light of today's episode and all the things that we're going to be chatting about, I feel like I'd have to say that a grow for me is going to be learning more about self-regulated learning. I've done some reading on self-regulated learning, and listening to your podcast has really intrigued me. And as someone who really values teaching her students the skills of learning, I'm just very excited to grow in this area and try and implement some new things after our conversation today. Do you have a glow or grow from your recent work?
I do. Well, I was thinking about this because I'd listened to your podcast here and I knew that this was a thing of the Teaching Together podcast. So I was thinking, actually, I'm currently doing some work with Wesley College in Victoria. They're trying to establish an AI, artificial intelligence kind of ChatGPT style model that acts as a learning coach. They're calling it Wesmigo. So Wesley Amigo. Wesmigo. And I'm working, I guess I'm a collaborator, a critical friend to the school, and I'm working on that project with a team of educators to try and help train this AI learning coach to, in essence, support learners in their self-regulated learning skills. And so the question for me is, can we train this model to have meaningful conversations about learning, but also for it to have the knowledge and strategies to be able to teach young people in those conversations. So I'm growing very quickly, I think, and I feel like that's going to continue to be a growth space for me. And my glow, which I understand to be a positive thing that is on the horizon maybe. I wrote a book. Yep. I printed the page proofs this morning, and so this will be the final look over for page proofs until it goes to printing, which means that we're very close to printing now, which is super exciting.
I'm very excited to get my hands on a copy when it's available. How good. Well, before we dive into self-regulated learning and all about the what, why, and how we do it, it is time for tea. Today, I'm just enjoying a plain old English breakfast. And yes, it's quite breakfasty. Are you having a tea, Shy?
I am actually, and I love that you have a tea segment. Yeah. My grandmother was such a big fan of tea and believed it was something that was very communal, that it brought people together, that sitting and drinking tea allowed for rich conversations. I love that you have that in your podcast. I'm drinking a cup of green tea, and I don't know if you're familiar. No, I'm not affiliated with T2 in any way, shape and form, but I was introduced to a green tea at T2 that is called Buddha tears, and they're little balls of leaves that actually unravel over time with the warm water. And so you sort of watch them unravel in your tea. It tastes great, but you also get the sort of slow experience of waiting for the leaves to unravel, which I think is really lovely.
Oh my goodness, that's amazing. We've said on multiple episodes that we're not endorsed by T2, but would be quite happy to be if they ever wanted to sponsor us. That sounds delightful. Well, if you're a teacher or pre-service teacher, or even if you've worked anywhere near education for more than 5 minutes, you would have heard someone talk about metacognition. And we all know that the definition for metacognition is thinking about thinking. But how much further could you really explain that? I think if somebody asked me, I'd probably actually get a bit stuck. And so what we'll hopefully see today is that cognition metacognition, and motivation all play really essential roles in helping our students to develop into self-regulated learners. Hopefully, by the end of this episode, you'll be able to see how self-regulated learning is evidence-informed and takes a much more holistic approach to learning rather than simply looking at the science behind cognition. So Shai, I was hoping we might be able to start with a bit of an explanation on how you would actually define self-regulated learning.
Thanks, Sierra. I love that you mentioned metacognition. So metacognition is actually one component of self-regulated learning. And anyone who's familiar with my work knows that I actually think of self-regulated learning as a very broad umbrella term for what I now understand to be at least 5 core categories. So in the research, typically you'll see 3: motivation, cognition, and metacognition as 3 categories. And then some models will acknowledge resource management as a 4th category, so how we manage resources in our environment, and a 5th model, or a 5th component, which is now more explicitly acknowledged in self-regulated learning models, is emotion. And so I think emotion used to just sit in social emotional learning frameworks, whereas now it's more explicitly in self-regulated learning frameworks. Whenever I ask educators to define self-regulated learning, they're pretty good at just sort of a base level understanding of what it means. And they'll say things like, self-regulated learning is when a learner is independently managing their learning process. They have an understanding or awareness of themselves as a learner and can set goals for themselves. They can plan 3 phases of self-regulated learning. They can plan, monitor, and evaluate their learning. And so they'll say things that, in essence, describe what we might more commonly understand as a self-manager, an independent learner. And that's really, in order to engage as an independent learner, we have to be able to self-regulate our learning. So as I mentioned, it's a really complex concept, but I did a TED Talk a couple of years ago, and I had to explain it to a public audience. And I racked my brain in the weeks leading up to that, thinking, how am I going to explain self-regulated learning to a public audience who have never, most people, my wife, for example, was not familiar with the term metacognition. And so I thought, okay, if people don't have that language, how would I explain it to them? And a metaphor that I use in that TED Talk, which I call the living room of the mind metaphor. And so if you can imagine for a moment that a light has gone on in the living room of your mind. Now, in this living room, there's a TV, and the TV is mostly on. It's your thoughts. It's your thinking. It's constantly changing, channel. Now, some people will feel so immersed in the television. They are the television. They are their thoughts. But some of us are able to, for a range of reasons, we're able to separate ourselves back from the TV as if we were sitting on a metaphorical couch, watching the TV, watching our thinking, observing our thoughts. That's the first level of metacognition, right? So when teachers say to me, it's thinking about thinking, they're referring to this idea that, metaphorically, we're sitting on a couch watching our thoughts, observing our thinking. Now imagine that you've stuck your hand down the side of the couch and you've found a remote, and you can change the channel, you can control your thinking. This, in essence, is self-regulation or self-regulated learning, in that now you're not just observing your thinking, but you're actually controlling and regulating that thinking. And that's actually the second level of metacognition. So often when teachers say to me it's thinking about thinking, I feel like that's quite a narrow definition, and it misses the component, which is a really critical part of metacognition, which is our ability to change or to regulate that thinking. So in order to use the remote effectively, we need to understand what the buttons are, how to use them, and when am I to use those buttons. And for some of our learners, actually, they might not have a lot of buttons. They might have buttons that they have relied on for years and years and years that in one particular context might no longer serve them well. And so we can actually get our learners to start thinking about what are the buttons that they have in their remotes, and in some ways use that as a bit of a diagnostic to get a sense for the quality of their knowledge that underpins their self-regulated learning capabilities. I had a pre-service teacher who was in the TED Talk, and he loved the idea so much that he actually went home and he drew up his own remote and he sent it to me on Instagram, which is really lovely when one of your learners goes and actions something they've heard. It's a beautiful kind of moment in learning where you reflect and think, wow, this has had impact beyond the immediate lesson. And so he sent me this remote, and originally I was like, wow, these are great. He's got, he's got a lot of self questions in there. He's got some goal setting. He had some motivational stuff. But as I sort of read through it deeper, I was intrigued because there weren't that many actually on there. I think he had about maybe 10 or 12 buttons on there. And I was curious. I wanted to know what other buttons that he used that he hadn't actually listed that I suspect he had. And so, that led to a conversation about it as well. And so I think almost I know one school that I work with loved the idea so much they actually got, A3 remotes printed, and the kids are able to almost write up, the different strategies they were learning over the course of a unit, but also what strategies they were currently using.
I was immediately imagining, drawing up a huge remote and laminating it and putting it on my classroom wall. And then as you explicitly teach a strategy to your whole class, that you can put sort of Velcro, the Velcro dot, the new button onto the remote as a constant, I guess, almost a bit like an anchor chart reminder for students about here's some of the strategies that you can be drawing on.
100%. Actually, another school that I work with has a strategy wall, and you're spot on in this sort of Velcro scenario that they actually, have been building with the students, so co-constructed. What are the core strategies, and for the students to be able to pick strategies from the wall that they can use to help them self-regulate in a particular learning task. So it sounds like you're thinking very similarly. I will say one other thing, Sierra, is that sometimes teachers who are working with neurodiverse learners will look at this metaphor and think, well, how does that apply to a neurodiverse learner? And I think that's a really valid question. I have the pleasure of also working with Novo Education Space in New South Wales, and they are a alternative education provider, and so have quite a number of neurodiverse learners in there. And when I shared this metaphor with the teachers from Novo, it was phenomenal how their brains just adapted the metaphor almost instantly. And they said to me, oh, well, for some of our learners, they might have 2 TVs, or some of our learners might have a TV with a radio playing on in the background, or for some of our learners, it might not be a living room, it might actually be a kitchen or a zoo or something different. And so they were able to almost instantly, because of the way they're trained to sort of translate knowledge into their setting, were able to kind of shoot off ideas for how this could be adapted for their learners. And they were actually going to get their learners, from what I understand, to get their learners to think about what their living room of the mind looked like for them as an individual learner. Is it, multiple TVs, is the radio, etc.? Yeah.
Well, because when I was reading evidence review by Mui and Bokov about the impact of self-regulated learning, one of the really interesting things it mentioned was that for neurodiverse students, or students who have identified learning difficulties, that teaching them these same strategies and, metacognitive monitoring and some of those sorts of things still led to improved performance for those students as well.
Yes, that's my understanding of the research as well, that self-regulated learning interventions, so anything that we do in a classroom that in essence is tailored towards promoting self-regulated learning, has a positive effect. The effect size varies depending on the nature of the intervention and the group, but I haven't anything that suggests a negative effect yet. So yes.
So if the effectiveness of various interventions is one reason why we should be teaching self-regulated learning, what are some other reasons that you would give for why we should be thinking about this or taking this back to our classrooms?
It's a great question, Sierra. Can I ask you, can you think of a learner who you would deem not self-regulating their learning very well?
Yes.
Plenty?
Plenty.
Teachers never have. It's one of the first activities I do with teachers is asking them to think about a learner in their classroom who's not self-regulating their learning very well, or who has potential to self-regulate their learning better. And it is always a point of laughter, because there's always plenty of examples, and if anything, the challenge is choosing which student we're going to focus on. So the first reason I would say is that we have learners in our classroom who could better self-regulate, and I don't need to tell you that, you already know that, and you can identify multiple examples for that. And so teachers often are coming to me with concerns about their students' learning behaviours, coupled with a desire to want to help their young people develop this learning skill set. And so often when they're saying to me, hey, Shai, I've got a student who's not actively asking questions in class. How can I help them develop their confidence so that they can ask questions? Okay, great. So we reframe the concern as a question. How might we build this learner's confidence so they ask more questions? Or another example might be an English teacher who comes to me and says, hey, Shai, I've got students who aren't taking risks in their writing, and I want them to take more risks in their writing because there's benefit in those risks. Great. So how might we help our students take better risks in writing? And so we can always reframe a concern as a question, and then the question guides us in terms of exploring activities and interventions that we might use in the classroom. So for reason number one from my end is that we want to help our young people, and in some ways we're concerned. We see an opportunity in our classrooms. But the second reason I would offer is that self-regulated learning has become one of the top sort of global skills that it's being listed on multiple kind of, top 5 skills for the future, top 10 for the, workforce, etc. And you can go to the OECD, you can go to the World Economic Forum, and you can see those skill sets, and you'll see self-regulated learning either explicitly listed, or you'll see elements of self-regulated learning listed. And so we're seeing it pop up in these top skill set lists, saying that it is a core skill for the future. And there was actually a paper that was published. It's a paper I often refer to when I'm talking about the future of work, is that there was a paper released late 2022 that actually the researchers interviewed leading professors in different fields, including learning analytics, artificial intelligence. So, these fields that are very prominent for the future of work. And they were asked, what's the number one skill that they believe is necessary for young people to have to be successful in the future? And Dragan Gasovic, who's a professor of learning analytics at Monash University, said self-regulated learning. And the reason he said self-regulated learning was the number one skill is because of the need to continuously upskill, reskill in the nature of our work as it continues. And for our young people, that's going to happen even more. And so his argument was simply that being able to self-regulate your learning becomes an absolutely essential skill to be successful in the future of work, if not now, I would say. So that's reason number 2.
I love the example of why it's so important, and setting our kids up for the future makes so much sense. When I first was interviewed for my job that I'm currently in, I'm trained across a few strange subject areas. So I'm agriculture, biology, and design and technology, which the headmaster who was interviewing me hadn't really seen that combination before. And he said to me, what kind of teacher are you? And I took a moment to think about it. And I said, well, actually, I think I'm just a teacher. Like, it doesn't really matter the context that I'm teaching in. My goal is to support the students that I have to learn how to learn and be good learners, and doing that with my curriculum as, I guess, a context for that. But really wanting to prioritize them walking away with skills that they can take wherever they're going, not just to ace my subject.
It's a fantastic mindset, Sierra, and not every teacher holds that. It sounds like you don't teach subjects, you teach young people, you teach children. And I think that is a profound positioning for an early career teacher. And I don't know how many of your colleagues or our colleagues, really, our teachers, share that same belief, because I think that is fundamental to teaching self-regulated learning, is that we actually disconnect and disassociate to some degree from our subjects. Not in a bad way. I'm a science teacher by training and taught science for many years. But when I started to learn about self-regulated learning, there was a shift in the way that I saw my subject. And it went from teaching kids science to using science as a vehicle to teach kids how to learn. And that was my shift. And I was probably 7 years into my teaching when I realized that. And thankfully I was still open, not too kind of grounded in my own beliefs that I, was so rigid that I couldn't change. But that was really profound for me to have that realization and go, wait, hold on, I've been focusing on the wrong thing here.
Well, they sound like great whys. For someone who's hearing this and thinks, yes, that sounds fabulous, what do we actually do with that now? We mentioned before strategies that we need to sort of teach our students, buttons that go on in our remotes. Um, what what are some strategies or categories of strategies, and where do we find them, and how do we teach them to our students so that it actually is making a difference?
Yeah. So I guess this, particularly for your Australian educators who are in your audience. So perhaps this is reason number 3 too. The self-regulated learning is in the Australian curriculum, and we're very lucky to have it listed in the Australian curriculum. It sits under the general capabilities. Sits under 2 general capabilities. One is the personal and social capability, and the other is the critical and creative thinking capability. And it's not listed explicitly as self-regulated learning, but there are components of it that sit within those 2 capabilities. And so goal setting, for example, is in there. Self-awareness of ourselves as learners is in there. Self-management is in there. And so there's multiple kind of elements of the curriculum that are listed in those capabilities, which could be a starting point for teachers in terms of, right, they could go to the Australian curriculum and think, right, I've got the curriculum here for the general capabilities. Now I just need to teach it. I don't know how well, Sarah, you find engaging with the general capabilities of the Australian curriculum. I feel like they're in some ways the forgotten.
Definitely. I forget they exist sometimes. Definitely, they feel like a bit of an add-on at the end, or something that you're just trying to make fit with what you already do, rather than reframing perhaps what you're teaching to prioritize more of those capabilities.
It's also the abstract nature of them that I think makes it even harder to engage with is, well, how do I teach self-management?
Yeah.
Much easier for me to teach my subject because that's much more concrete. And so therefore it's easier for me to access. So the task for me has been, how can I make these abstract soft skills more concrete for teachers, and bring some of the research around how to teach this into a really pragmatic way for teachers. So there's a range of ways we can, the how we can teach this in classrooms. And one of the many evidence-based approaches is known as explicit strategy instruction. And so we're really talking about fostering and developing our young people's knowledge of the buttons on their remote. Each of those buttons represents a strategy. And in order to use the button, we need to know what the button is, how to use it, and when and why to use it. So these are if you want some psychology in there, those 3 levels of knowledge relate to declarative knowledge, what the button is, procedural knowledge, how to use the strategy, how to use the button, and conditional knowledge, when and why to use it. And we need those 3 levels for a learner to engage with the strategy. And so explicit strategy instruction, and anyone who's heard me on a podcast before where I've spoken about explicit strategy instruction, I often share an approach known as NEMO-T approach, which is an acronym that I came up with to help teachers implement this in classrooms. And NEMO-T stands for name. So we name the strategy. We explain, so E, explain the strategy. Model the strategy, so M for model. O is an opportunity for practice. So we provide our learners an opportunity to practice the strategy. And then the T is activating transfer. So it's transfer. And what we want throughout the conversation is to ensure that our learners can see application of the strategy in a classroom context, but they can also transfer it and see how it might transfer to a different subject context or even outside of school as well. So, that's a really easy way to make sure we're hitting some of the targets when it comes to explicit strategy instruction. Now, I suspect, Sierra, you're thinking that sounds great, but what strategies should I be teaching? Is that right? That's
exactly what I'm wondering.
There are so many strategies, and I feel like this will be my second book. The strategies that we can teach, because that's the next question that people ask me. They ask me, how do I do it? And I say explicit strategy instruction is one way, and it's one of many ways, but I always pick that one out as a first step because I feel like it's low-hanging fruit. It's easy for us to do tomorrow in our classroom. And the next question is, great, so what strategies should I be teaching? Sarah, you probably already teach some strategies in your classroom. Let's start there. What strategies do you feel like you're teaching already in your classroom?
Yeah, I feel like, yeah, this is a hard one because I'm looking at my classes and trying to work out where are they battling maybe and what can I do to support that. One thing I did um, probably about 6 months ago now. It's definitely not perfect. I was finding that particularly for my junior classes, so my year sevens, um, they were not able to, um, I guess, manage when they weren't sure what to do next. They seemed to have very limited understanding of what resources they could access to help them, even though there were things like we would, because I teach a practical subject, I might go through a practical demonstration of, here's how you use this tool or this part of it for your next project. Then there might be videos on Google Classroom, which is our learning management system that we use, that actually have the video of that demonstration that they could go back and access. And then there's, people around them and all sorts of resources that we try and make available to them to help them through the, I guess, project development and production side of their project. And I would just find myself really quite stressed and overwhelmed a lot of the time because they would just come and swarm around me. I seriously considered wearing a like a pool donut to my class to teach them about personal space because they were really, 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 yeah, overwhelming me. And then, I mean, this was, I guess, part of me trying to be aware of myself too, is that because the classroom environment can get a bit loud when you've got, your dust fan extraction system on and there's tools happening in the background. It's already, I feel, a bit sensory overloaded in there sometimes. And then I'd turn around and find all these kids, just, 6 or 7 of them standing right behind me. And I would then start to get a bit maybe short and sharp with them because, and I probably wasn't answering their questions properly because I was feeling so overwhelmed. So I implemented this, I guess, what we would maybe call a help-seeking strategy, where I would identify a student in the class who was maybe just that one step ahead of where the bulk of the class was sitting in the project. They're just a little bit more efficient, or they had the opportunity to get on the machines first, and so they're sitting that one step ahead. And as a class, we decided to nominate this person to be called Bob, like Bob the Builder. Not really sure why, but that was their choice. And so each lesson I would choose a Bob, and I would give Bob a high-vis vest. And for that lesson, that was a resource that students could go to get some help with just those basic questions like, what do I do next? Or where is the glue gone? Or some of those kinds of questions that, freed me up to actually be supporting some of the students who were, really anxious about using saws or things that they really needed more adult support with. So I guess that's one thing that I've tried with my junior classes that I think has actually been really helpful in terms of just helping them to look for what resources they have around them to support their learning. I don't know what you'd think about that.
I like that, Sierra. I like that a lot, actually. It's very similar to a strategy that I call find a front runner. So find someone in the room that is just a few steps ahead of you. But I like yours, to be honest with you. And I think you could almost translate that into a more explicit version as find your Bob. If you've used that language in your classroom, at some point you might want to strip away the high-vis vest, and it becomes, so, you've explicitly framed it. You train them through this idea of, hey, there's a Bob in our classroom. Bob's wearing a vest, etc. And maybe at some point you go, to me it comes down to the framing. So it'd be at the start of an exercise where you go, hey, okay, what's the strategy that we can use if we get stuck? Who might we go and seek help from? And and then it says, well, maybe we could use the Bob strategy, or the, could you find someone who you could identify as Bob, and they could wear the high vis vest? Great, like we could do that, absolutely. But I think you guys are ready to transition the next step. So I want you to all, at the top of your page, I want you to identify someone who's your Bob. I want you to write their name at the top of your page, who you think is just a few steps ahead of you, metaphorically, or, just imagine hypothetically they're wearing this vest. And I want you to approach that person and seek help from them if you get stuck. Okay, I don't want you to all approach the one person who's wearing the vest. I want you to identify who's your Bob, who's your go-to, and start to transition them from the very explicit scaffold towards a more inherent kind of application of the strategy. And you might also, and then if you want to transfer that a little bit further, you might say, okay, when might we use the Bob strategy? You could call it the Bob strategy, but whatever feels comfortable for your class. You've just taken a very simple help-seeking strategy, but you've made it more fun and engaging for a learner. So then, outside, okay, now imagine that we're at gymnastics or at soccer, or, with footy or whatever it might be. How might you apply that who's your Bob strategy, or find your Bob in that context? What would that look like? And so you could have a conversation with them about how this strategy translates outside of your classroom. I think that would enhance that strategy, and that strategy is fantastic as an example of a help-seeking strategy. Now, to clarify for listeners, the way that I see self-regulated learning is 5 categories of knowledge. We've already mentioned motivation, cognition, metacognition, and we've mentioned resource management and emotion. Help-seeking sits under the resource management umbrella component of self-regulated learning. And so it's great. We need to develop those skills as well. Like, that's part of the framework. But I don't know if you do this, Sierra, but we also want to be teaching strategies for motivation, teaching strategies for cognition, teaching strategies for metacognition, teaching strategies for emotion as well. So we want to be hitting all of the categories, and not just at a surface level. We want to be teaching a repertoire of strategies so that students can essentially start to pick and choose which ones that they feel are effective for them in different contexts. For any of your listeners who are trying to grapple with the idea of the 5 categories, there's an image of that framework in a blog, which I have titled Beyond Cognition, Embracing the Multifaceted Nature of the Science of Learning.
I'll definitely link that in our show notes for people.
Amazing. Thanks, Sierra. I'm thinking one example might be useful here. It's a strategy that teachers often really like because it's very easy to implement the next day. So perhaps you and your listeners might be able to do this. Have you heard of the tally strategy?
No.
So this is my co-host on the Educator Self-Regulated podcast, Rory, and I actually developed this during my PhD. And it comes from a category of metacognitive strategies known as self-recording. And the idea is that when we self-record something, we actually bring our awareness to the behavior. And so we can use self-recording in classrooms to help learners become more aware of their learning and their learning process. And sometimes with that awareness, we automatically make changes. Okay, it doesn't always happen, but it automatically make changes. And one study that I read actually about cigarette smokers, before they were keen to reduce the number of cigarettes they were smoking, and the researchers said, right, okay, well, just as a baseline, let's just establish how many cigarettes you're smoking as a start. And so over the course of the week, the cigarette smokers were just recording the number of cigarettes they were smoking per day. And funnily enough, over the course of the week, there was actually a reduction in the number of cigarettes they were smoking. So no intervention had taken place. They were trying to establish a baseline, but self-recording has a dual purpose. It can bring awareness, but it can also intervene in that way. And so the tally strategy Rory and I created, so I would give out post-it notes to all my learners, and I would say, hey guys, I'm going to teach you a strategy that is known as the tally strategy, and it's one of many strategies that we call self-recording. And I might tell them the cigarette research, smoker research. I might also use an example from the gym. So, whenever you go to the gym for the first time and you get a personal trainer, they'll ask you to take a food diary. And so you record what you eat for the course of the week. And what happens as you start to record what you eat over the course of the week, you realize how many packets of chips you're eating, and you perhaps even make changes to the chips and the nature of what you're eating. So I might I'd give them a few examples of that, and I'll say, hey, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to self-record today. We're going to self-record our attention because, for my year sevens, let's pretend, I've noticed that we're all struggling a little bit with perhaps managing distractions, but actually let's reframe that and say we're struggling to regulate our attention, to control our attention and where we place it. So I want to teach you this strategy that's going to help you better regulate your attention. Let's see if it works, right? Let's have a quick conversation about what focus looks like in this classroom and what distraction looks like in this classroom. And I'll get the students to generate on task, off task behaviors in essence. And they will come up with two lists. So we'll have an on task on the board and we'll have an off task on the board divided by a line, right? And I'll say, right, okay, guys, what I want you to do for the next 45 minutes, I want you, every time you notice that your mind wanders and your attention goes off task, because that will happen, it's a natural part of the human brain, is that our mind will wander. But we want to be present here today. We want to be focused. I want you to, in that moment when you recognize that your mind has wandered off and you're thinking about breakfast or you're thinking about your friend or you're thinking about something else, there's going to be a moment when you catch yourself and you go, and I need to be here. I just want you to gently guide your attention back. I want you to make a little check on your tally and then just continue on with the work. Okay, so now this is not a competition. This is not about who has the most checks on their tally. I just want you over the course, we're not even going to publicly share these. I just want you over the course of the 45 minutes is just to take a tally for how often your mind wanders. And let's just see if that helps us gather information about the way our attention functions. And so then they'll do that for the course of the lesson. I might prompt them a few times. Hey, don't forget to make a check on your tally if your mind's wandering. And then at the end of the lesson, I would say, okay, hey, I want you guys to have a look at how many checks you have on your tally, on your little post-it note. And I want you to write a little reflection for why you think your attention was behaving in the way that it did. And so then I'll get the students to write down a little reflection and to share it with the class so they don't have to share how many checks they have on their tally if they don't feel comfortable. But you'll get students saying things like, oh my gosh, I didn't realize how often my mind wandered in the classroom. And I didn't realize how easily distracted I was by that noise outside the window. I didn't realize the birds were capturing my attention so much. And so suddenly we've got a really nice platform to have conversations about things in the environment that are influencing the way that our attention is behaving. And I might do it for a series of 3 lessons to get us to see how our attention changes with the time of the lesson, with the difference in where we sit versus, and whatnot. And then ask them to use that information to help them make better decisions about where they position themselves in a classroom or what choices they make in a classroom around their attention. But the idea here is that I'm helping them develop an awareness of their attention as a starting point. And then hopefully I'm able to teach them strategies to say, and a simple strategy might be, okay, well, restructuring your environment. Okay, so changing where I sit in an environment or what's available to me in an environment could minimize. So let's test it. If we change position, does that reduce the number of checks on my tally and therefore improve my focus, or does it not? And if it doesn't, let's just return to the status quo then. And so really empowering learners to be in control and sort of metacognitive. Yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah, my question, and I don't know whether you've done this enough to test it, but or what your thoughts would be on how much more effective would that to be than just moving a student because they can't focus. Whereas if you did that with your class and then asked them, the following week to all choose a seat that they felt like would reduce their tally, whether that would have a greater effect than you just restructuring the class yourself.
I think that's a great avenue to test, right? Like I used to always have conversations with my classes, and even now, still in a tertiary setting, I ask adult learners to think about the choices they're making in a classroom that's going to influence their learning in a positive or negative way. And I used to do this with my year sevens. People would say, year sevens aren't capable of doing that. I would hear things like that in the corridors. And I genuinely believe, and still do today, that we underestimate our young people. They're very capable, and we just have to create the conditions for them to be able to demonstrate that capability. And I would always even if it was just like the students had lined up outside, I worked at a school where that was cultural, lined up outside, I'd say, hey, before we even enter this room, just a reminder, when we enter this room, this is a space for learning, and this is about us making choices that are going to support that learning. So wherever you choose to sit and whatever resources you get out, I want you to make those choices with a clear intention that it is for learning. And then I would let them go in. And I hadn't said you have to sit here and you have to get this out and whatnot. I was really, it comes down to the framing and framing up. I think that's really, really important when it comes to self-regulated learning.
Mm. Really quickly before we finish up, do you have a motivation strategy that you could give us to help our students boost their motivation?
Yeah, gosh, there's so many. So many. And I should say, actually, in my books here, once you get it, there's probably about 10 or 12 strategies that are just dotted between the chapters to try and appease this one of, well, giving a strategy. So there's a lot of research around what we call value interventions and the simple act of asking our learners what's their why. And so one of the strategies that, again, Rory and I co-created together, because Rory is a primary school teacher, year 5 and 6, so it's always good to work with a practicing teacher to bounce ideas. He uses the what's my why strategy. And it's a simple prompt, again, post-it note or even at the top of your page, asking the students to, once they're clear on what a task is, he gets them to think about what's their why for the activity. And if they can't identify one, he helps them identify one so that they're always really clear on the reason why they're doing the task and why it's going to be useful for them. And there's different value beliefs that we can have. And so really we're trying to tap into some of those different value beliefs. But it just as a very surface level, it prompts them to think about why it's valuable to them. It gives you an opportunity as a teacher to go, okay, half my students haven't been able to write one, so they're not clear on why this is useful to them. So how might I make that really clear for them so they see the value in the task? And the research is, from what I've read in terms of value intervention research, like it's pretty consistent. If students have a clear sense for why they're doing a task and a deep sense of value in it, they're more likely to engage.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much. I think, I'm very excited to go and take some of those strategies. I like the tally idea, especially my students we rarely use books, everything's on iPads, and it seems like not an easy task to get them to just jot something down. It's a mammoth ordeal of let's all hand out a piece of paper and everybody, no one brings their pencil case in because they're so used to just working on their computers and things like that. But how easy it would be for me to just stand at the door and greet them with a Post-it note. And then, then we've got something that we can quickly, tally our observations on. I think that's very cool.
Yeah, I think any teacher who's trying like the tally strategy, what's really useful is even just getting at the end, get a raise of hands from the learners and sort of saying, hey, who have you found that useful for your focus? Raise your hand. And, I pretty much, I run it with a range of different age levels, and at 60, 70% of hands will go up, depending on the group. But then there'll always be a few that will say, no, it didn't really work for me. And I think that's really useful as well, because I'll always say, that's great. This is one strategy, and this is why it's really important that we'll play with a range of strategies so that you can identify which ones work for you, which ones don't. And for some people, they'll find the act of keeping a tally creates too much cognitive load for them because they're navigating a dual task of managing, a subject, or they're learning about a subject and trying to recognize when their attention's distracted, etc. And that creates too much cognitive load for them. So it's finding what works for you as a learner. That's what I would often say as well.
Well, I just want to say a massive thank you for taking time out of your day to be here and explain more about self-regulated learning and some of the strategies we can take back. Shai's new book, Educate to Self-Regulate, is coming out in June, and you can pre-order that through his website now. I can't wait to get my hands on a copy and dig my teeth into some more of those strategies that he's taken the time to write down. Definitely waiting for book number 2 that has heaps more strategies though, please. You can also have a listen to his podcast, Educate to Self-Regulate, which you can get on all your normal podcasting platforms. And if you've enjoyed today's conversation, let us know and leave us a 5-star review. We would be really grateful for that. Thanks so much again for your time, Shai, and enjoy the rest of your week.
Thanks, Sierra. Absolute pleasure. And looking forward to continuing the conversation.